bus can arrive. You might not think of it this way, but when you enter World 1 Level 6, you are experiencing 11.95 frames of lag. But of course, if the maintenance ends in that 0.05 frame window, the bus can still arrive on the 12th frame. While most of this maintenance period is deterministic, some factors take up a variable amount of CPU cycles. The game wants to prepare the values on the HUD's scoreboard, as well as prepare the color palettes of Mario based on his power-up state, in what is easily the most poorly written subroutine in the entire game. By manipulating your score and power-up, you could cause just enough additional lag to cause the bus to miss. However, on an emulator with improper frame timing, this 0.05 frame window could be larger, resulting in no lag frame when one should be present. So you can see why failing these tests is a pretty big red flag. FCEUX, shown here failing these tests, was used to create the warpless TAS of Super Mario Bros. However, inside World 3-1 on frame 17,407 of the TAS, due to improper frame timing, an edge case known as NMI suppression should have occurred, but did not. The result of which is, on actual hardware, a lag frame, but under these exact same conditions on the FCEUX emulator, the lag frame is not present, hence the ban from the speedrun leaderboards. In addition to the frame timing, well, there's a lot wrong with this emulator, but most notable for speedruns is the lack of unofficial instructions. Speedruns featuring arbitrary code exploits, such as the any % run of Super Mario Bros. 3, involve executing code from RAM. Since RAM is, in most cases, not easy to manipulate, there's a high probability of executing an unofficial instruction. By lacking the unofficial instructions, you could very easily run code that should crash the game, but instead does not. Alright, it's time to evaluate this emulator. Once again, we're looking at some alarming results. 10 out of 125 is still not great. That being said, it didn't crash running any of my tests, so I'm gonna give it some bonus points. I'm giving this emulator a C-. It's far from perfect, it has some weird quirks, but it runs pretty well. In 2004, Nintendo released the classic NES series for Game Boy Advance, which was a NES emulator for the Game Boy Advance. The first thing you'll notice is that the graphics are just... well... Mario has seen better days. Running my test ROM on this emulator is a bit of a mess. For the recording here, I modified the ROM so the tests that would have crashed the emulator simply return error code 0, which allows me to generate that table. And just look at it, all squished like that. That's great. It passed 4 tests. Alright, the final evaluation. It does run Super Mario Bros., so it's not failing, but wow, these results are rough. It crashes in 2 of my tests, and the ones that it passes are not particularly impressive. This is passing, but barely. D. But in 2011, the Nintendo 3DS hit store shelves, and with it came the Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console. Scoring 17 out of 125, this appears to be Nintendo's best emulator yet. It does crash on a few tests though, so let's talk about that. The unofficial instructions are an interesting case. Though they still act as no-op instructions, leaving all registers or RAM unaffected, they do have the correct number of operands, which is a step up from all the previous emulators. And what I found to be most surprising is that the unofficial LAX and SAX instructions are fully implemented. Well, except for LAX Absolute with offset X, which is incorrectly emulated as it doesn't affect the A register. And though the ISC instructions are behaving like no-ops as well, for some mystery reason, ISC Absolute with offset Y doesn't have the correct number of operands. And both zero-page forms of ISC crash the entire 3DS. But what's really interesting is that this emulator appears to have 2 different modes. There's the NES mode, that runs NES games, and then there's the Game Boy mode, that can also run NES games. And I cannot stress this enough, but the NES exclusive mode is the only one that crashes running these opcodes. I don't know. The final evaluation for this emulator. I'm giving some partial credit for the half-implemented unofficial instructions. This emulator is pretty much in the same area as the Animal Crossing emulator. It runs a lot of NES games quite well, despite the issues it has with many edge cases. It actually fails a few that the Animal Crossing emulator got right, but I am going to score it higher simply because it at least tries with the unofficial instructions. Slightly. I'm giving this one a C. And then, in 2013, the Wii U Virtual Console arrived, and they made a brand new NES emulator. With a decade worth of potential improvements, how well does the Wii U Virtual Console do on these tests? 9 out of 125. That's worse than the Wii Virtual Console. I'll be honest, with this emulator I don't have much to say. This one scores a C-, right there with the Wii VC. And then, 3 years later, we saw the release of the NES Classic Edition. A mini NES bundled with 30 NES games. I don't mean to shatter the illusion, but this is actually just a Linux computer running an emulator. Alright, how'd they do this time? Oh. I just want to remind you what these results have looked like for the entirety of this video up until now. 5, 10, 4, 17, 9, 94. Allow me to remove any and all sarcasm from the script here, because this is better than most NES emulators I found on the internet. By a lot. Yes, this is better than FCEUX. This is better than Nestopia. This is tied with Nintendulator. Of all the NES emulators I found online, including the one I created, only 4 of them scored better than this. By the way, Nintendo Switch Online has the exact same results, so I'm inclined to believe it's the exact same emulator. See, part of the fun with making this video was the genuine shock of seeing these results. This emulator passes some obscure tests. They got dummy read and write cycles in this. They got some obscure controller clocking behavior. They got proper interrupt polling. They've got interrupt hijacking in this emulator. The PPU data bus value decays. I cannot stress how cool that is. But wait, there's more. They passed every frame timing test I wrote. I feel like the effort and attention by Nintendo European Research and Development put into this emulator has been underappreciated. I just wanted to highlight the effort they put into this, before I highlight some things they got wrong. Despite the overwhelming effort put into accuracy, I was quite surprised to see they aren't even trying to emulate the CPU's open bus behavior. There are some DMC-DMA timing issues, a couple unofficial instructions are emulated incorrectly, and I actually made some discoveries with the APU frame counter while making this ROM, so it's not too surprising that that behavior I discovered isn't emulated. But overall, the testless emulator fails are mostly minor ones. So, let's evaluate this emulator. This is easily an A. Maybe an A- for not trying with open bus. It goes without saying, I mean, did you even see that bar graph, that this is by far Nintendo's most accurate NES emulator. But just out of curiosity, let's see how every emulator made by Nintendo compares to every emulator I found on the internet. On a slight tangent, there's been a lot of talk about FPGAs lately, which are kind of like emulators but with custom hardware. As of this video, the Super Mario Bros. Any % world record was performed on a Mr. FPGA, which might bring up questions surrounding the validity. Here are the results for that and the error codes for the tests it fails. Trust me, none of these would affect the gameplay of Super Mario Bros., so the Mr. FPGA is perfectly fine for RTA speedruns. And with all this info about emulators, incredibly obscure behavior that can only occur in custom code, and a myriad of issues that don't have any impact at all on the speedrunning scene, you might ask, okay, well who cares? Oh, you mean to tell me this emulator isn't implementing the backdrop colors for sprites should be mirrors of the backdrop colors for backgrounds? Whoa! That couldn't possibly have any effect on a speedrun, so it doesn't matter if an emulator correctly emulates that. Are you sure? I could create a tool-assisted speedrun that maliciously writes an accuracy test for some specific behavior in RAM, executes it, and then if it passes the test, crash the console, otherwise jump to the credits. This creates a situation where a less accurate emulator, incorrectly emulating even the nichest of edge cases, has an advantage over real hardware. So you can see why emulator accuracy is so important. You know, because I could do that. By the way, if you are making your own NES emulator, my ROM can be found in the description. You should totally screenshot the results and share them in my Discord. I would love to see that. I could not have made this video by myself. I gave my ROM to a lot of people for various reasons, so here's a list of everybody who helped out one way or another. If you want to support me, you can check out my game, Fantastic Fist, it's on sale, or you can support me through Patreon, which I'm now doing. This just helps me do more research and make more stuff like this. If you watched this video and felt inspired to make your own NES emulator, I wrote up a guide in the form of a really large, free post on my Patreon. And that's about it. I hope that despite the odds, this video was entertaining. Take care. If you've seen my previous video where I play Bad Apple inside Super Mario Bros., you might be wondering, how? Or maybe, what? 2 people asked why. In this video, I'll be walking you through the process I took to create this task. Hopefully by the end, you would have the knowledge to create a similar task yourself. Part 0. A general understanding. Glossary. This is a TAS, or Tool-Assisted Superplay. In many cases, that S stands for speedrun, but here my goal is to play a music video instead of go fast. Consider a series of musical notes on a timeline. If played in a digital workstation, the computer will always play the notes exactly as written without fail. Surprise! This was an analogy for TASes. Instead of notes on a timeline to play a song, consider button inputs on a timeline to play a video game. When we talk about a tool-assisted run, you might ask how under this context we define a tool. The popular examples are save states and playing the game in slow motion. In this video, I'll be using the hex editor to look at the console's RAM, the trace logger to see every instruction that was executed in a given frame, and as I'll discuss later in the video, we'll be writing our own custom tools. Arbitrary code execution. The ROM data of a NES cartridge is just a bunch of zeros and ones grouped into octets, which we call bytes. A different value of a byte represents a different instruction for the CPU to process. The ROM is just a bunch of bytes. Fun fact, RAM is just a bunch of bytes. For example, in the Super Mario Bros. 3 Any% run, the exposition of enemies in the stage can be manipulated to form a jump instruction that runs the game's credits. Now, writing a payload in RAM is not enough for an ACE exploit. We also need some way to move the console's program counter to RAM in order to execute it. In the case of Mario 3, this is performed by hitting an out-of-bounds note block. Something that excites many TASers is what we call total control, the ability to write anything anywhere in RAM and execute it. If we can write and execute any code we want, all we need to do now is figure out what to do with it. ACE in Super Mario Bros. Whenever I make a video showcasing arbitrary code execution in Super Mario Bros., I get the same comment. Mario 1 has ACE? It does. Asterisk. As I'll explain in a minute, it requires manipulating RAM with a different NES game and then swapping cartridges. Quite a few people pointed out that this task happens inside World N. Let's talk about why. When you defeat Bowser with fireballs, he gets replaced with a different object. The object that replaces Bowser is different for every world, but what would happen if you were beyond the 8 regular worlds of Super Mario Bros? For instance, it's possible to spawn Bowser in World 9, though you're unable to spawn a Fire Flower before encountering him. Let's make a table of all 256 worlds in Super Mario Bros. Let's also ignore the first 8 worlds, since we know Bowser is programmed specifically for those worlds. Filtering for worlds that contain Bowser, and then filtering even further for worlds where you can obtain a Fire Flower first, we're left with 13 worlds to investigate. You might be happy to hear that Bowser can be replaced with quite a few other existing objects. A fire bar, a moving platform, even a firework. There are a few worlds where defeating Bowser this way results in a jump to RAM, and this is where we want to investigate. Let's not stall for time here. You know the task is in World N, so what goes on when Bowser is defeated this way in this world? In World N, defeating Bowser with fireballs replaces him with an object with the ID of hex C9. This doesn't immediately jump to RAM, though it does start a chain reaction that will. The state machine's value is incremented, and that will lead to a jump to open bus, which is out of the scope of this video, so I'm just gonna wave my hands around a bit, and we're moving on. This moves the PC to RAM, which allows arbitrary code execution. Though this all relies on being in World N. How do you even get there? For this task, I'll be using a custom version of the BizHawk emulator that will allow me to swap cartridges in the middle of a task. You might be familiar with this trick where you can start Super Mario Bros. Beyond World 8 by playing tennis. I won't be using tennis for this task, but this should hopefully explain how cart swapping is used. Now let's talk about the arbitrary code we'll be running. To begin with, let's examine the code that runs right before the jump to RAM. The value of the state machine is loaded into the A register, and it will jump to code that handles jump tables. This is the code that handles jump tables, but we parse the table out of bounds. This leads us to open bus, which we use to jump to address 1181. The question marks here aren't just because this is RAM, but more specifically, this is uninitialized RAM. Super Mario Bros. Will never write to this area under normal gameplay. For example, if I were to boot up Kirby's Adventure, this area will be filled with some data, but after swapping to Super Mario Bros., it will still be there. Let's do a brief recap, while also explaining some other fun facts about RAM. For instance, there are only hex 800 bytes of RAM, but this is all the way in hex 1100. Due to RAM mirroring, address 1181 has the same value as address 0181. The entire range from address 0160 to 01E4 is never written to by Super Mario Bros. Since we can use another game to write here, and an ace exploit in another game would allow us to write anything here, we've got a golden ticket to execute anything we want. The question is, what do we write here? The goal is to play the Bad Apple music video, but we only have 132 bytes to work with, and that's definitely not enough to put the whole video in. We're going to need to write code that lets us write more code. This will be done by streaming data through the controller ports. Speaking of, how does a set of button presses correspond to a byte? There are 8 buttons on the controller, and each button represents a single bit of an 8-bit value. In this example, I want to write the binary number 01010101. Represented as button inputs, this is B, start, down, and write. Writing our own custom code. If we want to write our own code, we need to know where to write it and how many bytes we wish to write. To determine where we're writing, I'll read from the controller and store this at address C3. This will be the high byte of the 16-bit address. I'll read from the controller again and store it at address C2. This will be the low byte of the address. Now we have the location, let's determine the length. This is done by reading the controller once more, and I'll store it in the same area at address C1. Now if we look in the hex editor at the region we stored these, we can see how many bytes we want to write and where we want to write it. In this example, I'll be storing hex 34 bytes at address 700. Now to actually write the code at the target address. We're going to use the X register to determine how many bytes we've written so far, so let's set X to 0. I'll read from the controller and write to our target address with the X register being used as an offset. X is incremented, and that will happen in a loop until X is equal to our payload length determined by address C1. Now this is a whole lot of information, so let's actually see this payload in action and how I, as the task developer, can use this. Suppose I want to write some code here at address 210. First, I'll add the 3 controller inputs that form the location and length. 02 is written with just the left button, 10 is written with start, and I'll write 9 bytes here, which is going to be up plus right. Once these inputs are emulated, we'll see this at address C1. I'll paste a series of inputs that form the code I want to write, and as I step through each input, you can see the bytes being written in the hex editor. So that's how we'll write code in this task. Now we have to make a choice. Do I want to write more code at a different location, or do I want to execute some specific code? If I want to write more code, I'll leave the next input blank. If this input isn't blank, we're going to move the PC somewhere. Let's read the controller twice to set up the desired place to move the PC, and then an indirect jump instruction can take it there. Let's see this on the emulator too. We wrote code at address 210, now let's jump to it. First, I'll add anything to this next input so it isn't blank. Now to jump to 210, I'll write 2 and 10. And just like that, I'll step ahead a few inputs, and there it is. Here's the assembly code that I'm using to take these inputs and use them to write code. If you want to read it, go ahead and pause the video. You might wonder how this data is going to be written. That's a lot of bytes to manipulate. I'll be using a very brief total control task of Super Mario Bros. 3. That was it. That was about 3/4 of a second, and everything is all ready for Super Mario Bros. This was likely a lot to take in, so let's recap. A task of Mario 3 is used to write a payload and manipulate RAM so Super Mario Bros. Can begin in World N. Defeating Bowser in World N leads to a chain reaction ending with this payload being executed. This payload allows me to use controller inputs to write my own custom code and execute it. And now, we're ready to talk about the Bad Apple music video. To begin with, let's cover the graphics. The graphics. How to convert the video into Mario tiles. This is all the graphics data of Super Mario Bros.
Hello everyone! fire.